are back. Okay, so we're going to start with the Morphew case, if you guys know what that is. Suzanne Morphew went missing in May of 2020 in Colorado. This case has spanned about 5 years now. And at that time, people had their eyes, their suspicion on her husband, Barry Morphew. This is a case that started near the Colorado Springs area, but quickly gained national attention because people were kind of looking at Suzanne, what was their life like, what was their marriage life, and why would she go missing? They have 2 beautiful daughters, they were teens at the time, and so it was very odd. In May of 2021, Barry Morphew was arrested for her murder, but at that time, Suzanne's remains were still not found. Nobody knew where she was. And I think a lot of people watching probably know this, but I always try to kind of give some context. It is very hard to prosecute a nobody homicide case. Even if you think you have other evidence, it is all circumstantial for the most part, unless you have those remains. So in April of 2022, a judge dismissed the case, but without prejudice, which means that they can refile the case if they find more evidence or something new comes to light. In September of 2023, Suzanne Morphew's remains were found in Colorado, south of their home. And when they tested her remains and did the autopsy, they found something odd in her system, a chemical called BAM. Now, BAM is used to tranquilize deer. Why is that important? Because Barry Morphew was a deer farmer in Indiana and at one point had access to that chemical. So in June of this year, so just a couple months ago, Barry Morphew was re-arrested for Suzanne's murder, but this time he was arrested here in Arizona. A lot of people didn't know that Barry had relocated down here. He was living in the Cave Creek area in a trailer. We later learned through court documents and police investigation. And he was extradited from Maricopa County back to Colorado to now face these charges. Again, this case has some extremely bizarre aspects to it. For one thing, we learned through the investigation that Suzanne was skeptical of Barry having an affair, so much so that she bought a spy pen that could record a conversation or record something like that for Barry. But Barry also was suspicious that Suzanne was having an affair. Both of them had alleged infidelity, and there was a bizarre GPS tracking situation going on Barry's phone. When investigators were looking at it, the day that Suzanne went missing, his phone showed this location of all over their property and all over their house, almost in circles, just like that. And they thought possibly he was chasing Suzanne around at that time. He told investigators he was chasing a chipmunk around the property, which is also what? So bizarre, so many strange aspects to this case. Their daughters vehemently support Barry. They do not believe that he killed Suzanne Morphew, which it really complicates this entire case, and it is very perplexing to so many people who have been following this nationwide. Why are we talking about this week? Barry had a bond hearing. This becomes important because this is whether he's going to stay in jail or not before a murder trial. His bond was originally set at $3 million cash only, which means up front you got to pay the $3 million in order to get out. His defense team wanted to lower that bond to $500,000. Much different. Going into the hearing, Suzanne's brother had actually written a victim impact statement and submitted it to the judge. And I just want to read a couple words that he said. This is David Mormon, Suzanne's brother. And he wrote, quote, "She now understood her death was a symbolic culmination of her marriage, one where she was nothing but a live trophy for public display by a cunning predator, much like the animal trophies he had displayed on the walls." He also wrote to the judge, "I am requesting a life sentence with no chance of parole. If the truth were acknowledged, Barry Morphew is a soulless, sadistic, amoral predator that has hunted or used those around him his entire life." Those were extremely powerful words, something that the judge could take into account before the hearing. So the judge had that. Then both parties were in the courtroom in Alamosa County to then argue whether his bond should stay at $3 million or whether it should be lowered to $500,000. Now, this is an interesting aspect because we hadn't had some of these details before. But basically, the state said that Barry had been doing some weird things since in jail. For example, they said he's been conducting business in Arizona still from behind bars, but under the name of Lee Moore. They said he's been transferring large sums of money into other people's names. And of course, they say at this time, this case is a lot different because Suzanne's remains were found, and that's a huge aspect in this case. The defense is trying to say, or is at least arguing, that this is not that much of a different case from the first time, and that, you know, this should be a lot different. He was released the first time. The state says, okay, yeah, but Suzanne's remains weren't found in that first case. So clearly there's so much more that's different. You have the body now. So they're arguing this in court. And I want to play both sides of things because, of course, kind of the center of this whole case is whether or not Barry Morphew potentially, allegedly, used that BAM chemical to kill his wife, Suzanne. And I want to play what the state said. You're going to see this footage from behind the scenes within the courtroom this week, but the state got up there and presented first. This is what they had to say.
The remains of Suzanne Morphew after an autopsy contained a chemical compound that Mr. Morphew had almost exclusive access to, tying him directly to the remains of his wife. The case in 2021 was arguably entirely circumstantial with no body. This case is very different.
Okay, so that's what the state was saying. You know, obviously you have a circumstantial case versus direct evidence. Direct evidence is going to be huge. And in this case, that's now what you have with Suzanne being found. That is the crux of the information that we had heard over and over, was that he had exclusive access to this BAM chemical, that nobody else in basically the state of Colorado had any other access to this. So nobody else would have been able to put that in Suzanne's body or use that in any sort of capacity. What was new in this hearing was what the defense rebutted with, basically trying to talk about the fact of when Barry had access to this chemical, which was not at the time that Suzanne went missing. So I want to play what the defense said in argument to that.
The BAM that the district attorney mentions that Mr. Morphew had access to, I want to be clear on, was prescribed to him in the state of Indiana in 2018. Mr. Morphew has not had access to BAM since 2018, and the indictment says that nobody in the immediate region, meaning the 12th Judicial District, who was not otherwise lawfully prescribed BAM, had access to BAM, leaving out the fact that Mr. Morphew himself has not had access or prescription to BAM since 2018, and ultimately, law enforcement did not find any BAM in Mr. Morphew's residence, in his garage, or in his gun safe. And so this narrative that the people put in their indictment that Mr. Morphew has ties to and access to BAM, and is completely silent to the fact that that was an out-of-state prescription legally prescribed to him for a deer farm that he had not owned in years.
Okay, so the defense obviously talking about the fact that Suzanne disappeared 2 years after Barry allegedly had access to that BAM chemical. So what came of this hearing? Well, the judge listened to everything, and interestingly enough, the judge said something about the fact that Barry's 2 daughters were sitting behind him in that hearing, and she noted that that meant something to her, that she took that into account, that the couple's kids support Barry in this entire endeavor. But she did keep the bond at $3 million. Not cash only, though. Basically, now it's a secured bond, which means that if Barry Morphew can find $300,000 to pay up front, then he could potentially bail out even on this murder charge. And it's been widely known that Barry has had access to large amounts of money. So it is definitely not out of the question that Barry Morphew could bond out any day now. And that's something that a lot of people following the case are watching. However, his defense attorney had said he would like to return back here to Arizona. And the judge said no. So there's a couple conditions. He's going to have to wear an ankle monitor if he does make bond. He can't leave his house for any reason except to appear in court or for medical issues. He must only use the name Barry Morphew. He cannot go by Lee Moore to conduct any of that business. And he may not leave Colorado for any reason. So we will not see Barry Morphew back here in Arizona unless he is acquitted of this crime and then comes back here after. But that's what the judge decided. So far, he has not bonded out. Would not be surprised, though, if he finds a way to do so. I want to bring in our live interview this week. This is Alexis Dominguez, one of the reporters here in Arizona. But Alexis, throughout your reporting career, you were a reporter in Colorado Springs, and you were working there when Suzanne first went missing. My understanding is this was a huge case in Colorado at the time. I know you said, though, to me that there was a lot going on with women getting murdered at the time and kind of these bizarre aspects. So I just want you to take us back to 2020. And we're talking about May of 2020, so COVID's also going on. What was this original investigation like from your end and your perspective? Were people looking at Barry from the start as a potential suspect?
Definitely. And I think the reason is it's basically because it came at a time where there were two other cases that were playing out that were huge cases, not just in Colorado, but nationwide. So the one that a lot of people know are Shanann and Chris Watts. That happened in 2018. And then that same year, there was another case, a woman named Kelsey Barrett. She went missing in 2018 on Thanksgiving Day. So fast forward to 2020, Mother's Day, and Suzanne Morphew goes missing. I think immediately everyone believed the husband may have something to do with it. And it really was just because of the two previous cases where the husband, Chris Watts, and then Kelsey Barrett's fiance, Patrick Frazee, were essentially number one suspects in those cases.
It's interesting and, yeah, easy to make that kind of connection or assumption. But if we're looking at the evidence, too, and even just their relationship, take out those other cases going on in Colorado, were you guys finding out pretty quickly these marital issues that Barry and Suzanne were having?
Yeah, they were pretty new to the area. So I think Suzanne, at least, was trying to make some new friends. At one point, we interviewed one of her friends, and she told us that while she was very private, there were rumors going around that Barry Morphew may have been verbally abusive and did have anger issues. So I think that was a big part of why it really stood out to people that, you know, he may have had something to do with it.
What's your take on the BAM chemical? Listening to the state and the defense kind of give their arguments one way or the other, one saying he's the only person that had access, the defense saying he didn't have access at the time. You know, in your professional opinion, do you think anybody else would have had access to this chemical that would have killed her?
You know, it's hard to say. I think a lot of people believe that if he did have access to it, they were from Indiana and he could have gone back, known someone who was in Indiana who had access to BAM, or maybe still could have had it because he was the only person in Colorado who, you know, would have, I guess, in Indiana, who would have had access to that. So I think it's not completely out of the question that he could have possibly brought it back from Indiana and still kept it in Colorado. But, you know, it's hard to say.
Yeah. When they were searching for her, were you involved in any of the searches in the area? I mean, are we talking woods? Did we know if Barry or anybody else was familiar with these like kind of wooded areas where you would, you know, put remains if that was something you were trying to do? I know her remains were found not terribly far, but south of that property, right?
Yeah, so I think the area where we know that she went mountain biking, that's a wooded area. So initially, a lot of people thought maybe she got hurt, maybe she fell off her bike. So the initial search when it came in that she was missing was really to find if perhaps she had fallen off her bike and was hurt and wasn't able to get back up. And once they found the bike in that wooded area, then it really became a case of, okay, why is her bike here? but she's missing, her cell phone's missing. Eventually, they ended up finding her car. In her car, they found her cell phone and her purse with her ID. They also found her camelback backpack, which would have had her water. So if she was going biking, then why were some of those things found in her car? And another thing I should mention is that Barry Morphew worked in construction. So a lot of people initially also thought, okay, where are the properties that he's currently working on? And there were rumors going around that people thought her remains may have actually been in concrete in the foundation of one of the homes that he had been working on.
Interesting. Obviously, they ended up finding them in a different place, but I mean, these are the things that are being discussed when this investigation starts. You know, the maybe most perplexing part of this entire case is the fact that their daughters have, you know, stood by him steadfast. They've, and almost in like a showy way too, they've been holding hands outside of court, things like that. They were sitting behind him in the hearing this week, which was a huge sign and show of support by them. You know, what do you take away from that? Suzanne's brother, in his victim impact statement letter, said that Barry has manipulated the daughters into maybe thinking he's innocent. What do you make of that?
Her sister, Suzanne Morphew's sister, had also said that Barry was emotionally abusive. A week before Suzanne went missing, she had texted her sister saying that she wanted out of the relationship, that he was being emotionally and verbally abusive. So I think it's fair to say that there is some sort of manipulation there. So it could be a case where he is also manipulating his two daughters. But that's definitely something that I think shocked a lot of people, especially because we know at least one of their daughters was supposedly very, very close to her mom. And Suzanne had even opened up to her about some of the abuse that she had gone through. So knowing that background, I think a lot of people were surprised to see that they still had their dad's back. And they even did an interview on Good Morning America where they backed him and they talked about what a great father he was. And then to see this case playing out now and to see that they're still supporting him, I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because at this point there have been a lot of things that have come out in this case that perhaps weren't really known when she initially went missing in 2020, and they were supporting their father.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest thing, was in that first case, her remains weren't found. So it was a little bit easier to say, hey, yeah, no, he was not involved in this. But now, obviously, with the remains found, it just changes things. And I think people were expecting possibly the daughters to not support him this second time once they found what they found in the autopsy and the BAM chemical within her system. So it is interesting. It's kind of like that family drama dynamic that we're watching play out in real time, but in a legal system setting. So it is fascinating from this perspective. I know you've been paying attention. I have as well. I appreciate you coming on the show, giving some of that insight just of how everything kind of started with this case and where we are now. I know we'll both be following this as it continues on to likely a trial. But I appreciate your insight. Thank you so much. And we appreciate everything you do for the reporting. So we'll talk to you soon, Alexis. Thanks again. And thanks to everybody who has been on the show so far. Appreciate it. Okay. So we are getting ready for the next segment here. We'll continue following the Morphew case as we go on with the show in the next coming months into the trial, which we likely will be following next summer when that's slated to happen. But coming up next after the break, the Netflix documentary everybody's been talking about. We have a lot to talk about with you guys with it. I want to hear your questions. I want to take them. And we're going to talk through it. Unknown Number on Netflix, dissecting the psychology about it all. We'll have that coming up on the other side of the break. Our second segment here, the Now Playing segment. This is stuff where we talk about what's going on Netflix and Hulu and HBO and all of those things that everybody loves to watch. This has been a big one. And this is an interesting documentary for me to talk about because I'm used to talking about kind of like the true crime documentaries or docuseries that involve murder. as you guys are all used to hearing me talk about. This one is a much different true crime aspect. This is teenage manipulation, this is threats, this is cyberbullying, but it culminated in somebody going to prison and spending time behind bars for a crime that nobody expected she would have committed. So we're talking about Unknown Number. It's the new documentary on Netflix. You've probably seen it. And I will say we are going to give away some spoilers in this. So if you haven't seen it yet, maybe just tune out for a second, come back here in a second, because we want to talk about the psychology of everybody involved. So if you've seen it online and on Netflix, this deals with these teenagers in Michigan who are in high school, and they are getting different text messages for about a year and a half that are odd. That's Lauren and her boyfriend, Owen. And these two are kind of the center of this entire case. Now, their parents, among the other parents of teens who get these bizarre, threatening, kind of sexual text messages, end up being part of this documentary. And these messages kind of start out with like trying to break up Lauren and Owen, that there's something more sinister going on and that these other people are involved. And it would be like in real time. They would get these texts like as they were on their way to a sporting event or anything like that. And you can see them on the screen there. It'd be like, he hates you, he thinks you're awful, things like that. But it would ramp up and then become a really big problem. And people were scared. I mean, they didn't know who was next and why. Nobody knew why Lauren and Owen were targeted. They seemed to have a pretty steady, great relationship. But this went on for thousands of text messages for about a year and a half. And eventually, they get the police involved. There's now multiple students who have received these texts. Lauren and Owen are trying to continue their relationship on while they're receiving these. And everybody is thinking, okay, this is coming from another high school teen, maybe somebody who's involved in the sports games with them, or people who are like kind of close to their friend group, just close enough to know what they were doing, where they would be in that kind of real-time moment. And then it comes out, and you can see it right there on your screen, that the crying there is from Lauren's mom, Kendra. And she starts out talking about how hard this has been and how difficult it's been for her daughter, and that they're in this investigation, and she had actually been part of the investigation, had kind of inserted herself to police. And when police eventually run the IP addresses of where these texts are coming from, they're able to kind of decode those, and every single message ends up only coming back to one cell phone and one cell phone only, and it's one that's connected to Lauren's mom, Kendra. That part shocked everybody who watched this documentary. Why on earth would a mom target her own daughter, send her own daughter and her boyfriend threatening sexual messages, hateful messages, bullying messages, and then continue this web into other kids and become this whole mess for a year and a half? It was stunning when people learned this in the documentary. And then even more stunning when Kendra was a part of the documentary, agreed to be part of the documentary. So I talked to a forensic psychologist about this, because in the documentary, they also interview a psychologist, and the diagnosis that they kind of come up with for the situation is they kind of deem that Kendra has cyber Munchausen. So you hear a lot of like Munchausen's or Munchausen's by proxy, where somebody would make their child sick to then have their child rely on them and get the medical treatment, like Gypsy Rose, in cases like that. But now they're saying this is almost a cyber Munchausen syndrome situation, where Kendra wanted Lauren to come to her in a time of need. Like, Lauren's upset over these messages, so now she needs me, her mom, and I'm going to be there for her. Very strange situation, something we haven't really heard of, like cyber Munchausen's before. But that was one take on it. So when I interviewed a forensic psychologist, he watched the documentary, Dr. John Delatorre, and then he gave me his insight. He does not believe that this is cyber Munchausen's per se. He feels that there's something else at play, and I want to share that audio with you.
An avenue that isn't really explored all that much is a possible personality disorder, particularly borderline personality disorder, in which someone has instability in relationships, right? They either run really hot or run really cold. Sometimes they can feel kind of empty if they don't have attention. They fear abandonment. And there's a level of attention-seeking behavior, including attention-seeking behavior that would be problematic, like harming yourself or harming other people, behaviors like that would bring attention to the individual, that I think probably needed to be explored a little bit more. I think there is a level of attention that we kind of see more in someone with a problematic personality disorder, as opposed to someone who's wanting the attention of having a child in distress or being in distress.
Okay, so that was one take from Dr. John Delatorre about borderline personality disorder. And honestly, a lot of predators that I deal with in terms of the cases we investigate have that similar diagnosis or possible diagnosis when psychologists are looking at what they want. And a lot of times it does come back to attention. But then you have this aspect of, okay, let's say you have that, fine. But there was this sense from a lot of people that Kendra was attracted to Owen, that she actually wanted a relationship with Owen, and that Lauren had that Kendra herself couldn't have that. And so she was going to kind of perpetuate this plan because of her attraction to Owen. Now, some people have asked, okay, well, is that like a pedophile? I mean, you could look at it as such. Dr. Delatorre was telling me that there's kind of an age difference where it becomes like a different phrase, where the pedophile tends to be younger, and that they would have just barely been over this age where it's like a different situation, still a predator of a child, but a little bit different of a category than like a 5 or 6 year old, somebody who's sexually attracted, disgustingly, to a child like that. This, though, Dr. Delatorre felt was quite a bit different. He felt that this isn't so much about like a sexual attraction to children, but actually more so a jealousy of wanting to live a life that Lauren had. And he explains a little bit more about why this feels different than like an attraction for a child from an adult.
I think it's more complex than just a simple, was she sexually attracted to Owen? I think she was more attracted to the idea of being Lauren's age herself, and the relationship that Lauren gets to have and all of the firsts that she gets to have that Kendra doesn't get to have. And I think over time that can be confused from a desire for having a relationship like what your child has, and kind of distorts and corrupts and becomes perverted into this idea that we're now lusting after this person. I don't think she has a sexual interest in teenagers. I don't think so. But I think she started confusing what she wants, what she wanted to have, those experiences again, with a lustful interest.
I thought that was fascinating analysis from Dr. Delatorre, and it made a little bit of sense to me. Like when you look at the kind of person that Kendra appears to be and what she was struggling with in this documentary, that did seem to be more of it, less about Owen and like a sexual attraction, more about this jealous desire to live what Lauren was living. Now, there was this odd part of the documentary where they show the body camera footage when the sheriff's department comes to basically let Kendra know, hey, this phone has now been traced to all of these text messages to these kids. But in that moment, it's very bizarre. Lauren is there, and the sheriff's department, the officer is basically being like, your mom's had a hard time. She's been struggling with things. It came to this head, kind of like that, where they didn't really explain what she was actually accused of in that moment and what was going on. So people were really surprised when they saw that Lauren was pretty unreactive, unresponsive in that moment. And then Kendra's hugging her, and she seems to be, reactive to that, hugging her back. People were like, why would she have acted like that in that moment? Well, for one thing, I don't think that the deputy there explained what was actually going on to make it clear to her that her mom was actually the one that they believed was sending all of these text messages. But two, you hear later in the documentary that Lauren is considering still wanting a relationship with her mom. Kendra went to prison. She served time for a little over a year, and now she is out of prison. I don't think at this point that Lauren and Kendra had contact yet, but Lauren definitely seems open to it in this documentary. And some people said, how could she go back to having a relationship when your mom made you the victim and was a bully predator toward you, and it never needed to be that? And when I talked to Dr. Delatorre about that, I asked, is it surprising that Lauren still would be open to a relationship with her mom? And he said, actually, no, given that her age and what she might be able to comprehend versus what she seeks from her mom. He said he actually thought it would be more odd at this point in her life if she didn't want any relationship at all. He explained this a little bit more, and so I want to play you guys that audio.
There's so many questions about how this family actually interacted with one another behind closed doors that when we just look at it on its face, I would say, of course, a child wants to have a connection with their mother, despite whatever their mother did, even if that mother said some pretty heinous things. I think a child is willing to override those behaviors just to have that connection again. But there's also something to be said about trauma bonding, and that there might have been some underlying issues that were happening in that house that perhaps she needed to be, so quote unquote, cold, right? That she needed to behave in a way that is kind of not responsive in expected ways in order to kind of survive what was going on in that household.
I thought that was a pretty interesting take from him too, like what else was going on in that house. Clearly there were issues that were beyond just the text messages, because in that same body camera that you saw, you see Sean, the husband, learning that his wife was the one who was sending these text messages. And then you also learned that she had actually been fired from a job a year before, but he had told her that she had quit the job. And it's like there's clear lies and turmoil that's going on behind the scenes. So we don't really know what position Lauren was in at that time too. Some people in the documentary allege that Lauren and Sean both knew that Kendra was sending these. Other friends of Lauren's have been on TikTok saying she did not know at all that her mom was sending these. So it's one of those things where, people have kind of two camps of thought on that. But either way, it would not be surprising if Lauren does try to establish some sort of relationship and maybe is more forgiving just because of the age that she is. She's now 17. She was 14 when this was going on. So if that kind of gives you a little bit of a perspective, we're talking like literally freshman year to senior year, her entire high school of dealing with all of this and the aftermath of it too, after her mom was locked up behind bars for it. So crazy documentary. I know some people commented this is weird and is such a strange case, and it really is. Something that I haven't seen much before, and you're left kind of thinking like, did this really happen? Is this serious? And it did. So if you haven't watched Unknown Number yet, I know we obviously just gave away what happened, but it's so interesting. And there we go. I can see the comment now. That case is so weird. It is so strange. But if you haven't watched it yet, even though we're talking about it here and you would know what happened, it is still really interesting to watch how this investigation unfolded and when the police were actually involved in the case itself. One of the top documentaries, movies on Netflix right now, Unknown Number, crazy. I want to thank Dr. Delatorre as well for being a part of that conversation, doing that interview with me. So we got one more segment here coming up. There is a wild murder case here in Arizona where a teen was found burned, dismembered in a burn pit a couple years ago. But there's a really odd aspect going on with the suspect who should be going to a murder trial soon. But he won't be right now, and there's an odd reason why. We're going to get into that here after the break. Welcome back, everybody, for the final segment of True Crime AZ Live this week. This is our On the Docket segment, a really interesting one because we talk about kind of some big cases that are going on the docket, not just here in Arizona, but also all over the country. And this one is specifically an interesting and bizarre case because it involves a teenager who was from Nebraska, visited Arizona, and ended up dead in a burn pit. So I want to show you some video from what we know in this case. It was 18-year-old Parker Leak. He was visiting from Nebraska, and this is Anthonie Ruinard. So you can see them there. There's Parker and Anthonie. Obviously, looking at the video, you can clearly see there's a large age gap there. Anthonie Ruinard was 37 and Parker was 18. He comes out here, and his family and friends, they don't even know why he came out here, but they report him missing when he doesn't make his flight back home to the Midwest. And it's then that there are remains found in this kind of Bulldog Canyon area of the desert here in Arizona, truly middle of nowhere, but in horrific condition. They actually had to use his teeth and dental records to be able to identify him because the body was in such bad decay and left in this kind of dismembered state. So extremely concerning with why on earth Parker Leak ends up dead after visiting here from Nebraska. But as investigators go through, they're trying to kind of comb through his whereabouts and what's going on. So they find out that Parker and Anthonie leave a club, a Phoenix club, together in like the early morning hours just before he's last seen alive. They then go to a gas station, and then that is the last time that Parker Leak is ever seen alive. But after he died, Anthonie Ruinard allegedly is using Parker's credit cards to buy things. And so they're able to link this kind of connection between Anthonie and Parker together, and Anthonie is arrested for murdering Parker Leak. To this day, we still have no idea of a motive. It is bizarre how these two got connected. Clearly, they must have gotten connected, we think, prior to Parker Leak coming out here. Was he coming out here to do some sort of deal with Anthonie Ruinard? Was there some sort of connection between like a group of people that were trying to hang out, but it was like kind of some sketchy, like underground stuff? We don't know. It's very weird. But now Anthonie Ruinard should be facing a murder trial for Parker Leak's death. And he will, except for the fact that we were going through the court docket and we saw that all of the hearings in this case have been vacated until further notice. Why? Because Anthonie Ruinard didn't show up in court. But he didn't show up in court because he's being held in federal custody now. So we're going back, me and Sean, our assignment desk editor, are going back to find out, wait a minute, okay, he's in federal custody. He's not showing up for his murder trial case. What is going on? So we go back to look at the records. Anthonie Ruinard was also indicted on federal fraud charges. This goes back to 2023. Apparently, according to the court documents, he scammed 54 victims out of $5.6 million in an investment fraud scheme. He pretended to be some successful investor worth more than $400 million, and he would get people to invest in his real estate, venture capital, stuff like that. And then he was supposed to return this money, and they basically had this long list of like all of these people losing thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, which then ended up being more than $5.6 million. Anthonie also owned a restaurant in Tucson, so there was people that knew him there too. So it seemed like he was kind of one of those like entrepreneur businessmen, but sketchy. And so now he's facing these federal charges, and we knew that he had a fraud case, but what we didn't know was how or when he was transferred to federal custody, because it was the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that arrested him for murder, and that's how he ended up behind bars. So now we're looking at this federal fraud case, and it looks like he has just pleaded guilty to those charges. He should be sentenced next month, but until then, everything is on hold for the murder charge, which is odd. And so I started to try to figure out why would a federal fraud case supersede a murder trial when he was originally arrested for murder in the first place? And honestly, I haven't been able to really get a clear answer. I talked to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, who told me they have to do what he's in custody for now, that their case will absolutely continue. He will go to trial for Parker Leak's murder, but they have to do this federal custody case first before the state can proceed with their case. But I was like, okay, like he was in MCSO custody. How did that change? Where did that change? And they said, you should talk to the sheriff's office. So then I reached out to the sheriff's office, who basically then said, we have nothing to do with the federal case or the federal custody. And so I actually followed up with a question and said, okay, but at some point somebody facilitated this move. What I can't seem to get a clear answer on is, does a federal fraud case take priority because it's the feds, over a state murder case where a teenager was killed and dismembered. It seems odd. And I can't seem to get a specific answer as to how that works out. So basically, we're still trying to figure that part out in this case. But obviously, a lot of people have been waiting for this to go to trial. It's been some time now since Parker League was killed. And I've had some conversation with his family and friends on Facebook who have actually asked me kind of just like checking in on the status of the case. Because it is such an involved case, it does take a while to get to trial. But this is just adds like this bizarre, unusual kind of layer on top of this whole thing as to why he still isn't going to trial yet. He should have been in court for this in fall into winter of this year. So we have to now wait for this fraud case to play itself out in federal court, which is harder to follow because there's not cameras allowed. It's not kind of the same access that we have in this murder trial. I want to take a couple questions now that we have from people commenting in, writing in. The restaurant owner in Tucson, is that the case? Yes, it is. So he owned that restaurant, I think Patouche. I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but down in Tucson. And I remember when Anthonie was first arrested in this case, our Tucson sister station down there was doing interviews with people who went to the restaurant or worked at the restaurant at some point who were really surprised. Like they said, he seemed really friendly. And what is the likely sentence for the other case? I'm not sure. That is a really good question. Often it's a little bit different when it's like a federal fraud case. It kind of depends what that looks like. Obviously, it would assumably be shorter than what you might face for murder. But I know when you're messing with the feds and you're messing with millions of dollars, those can be higher sentences than people typically see. Just a case that comes to mind, like if you follow the Chrisleys and the Chrisley family, Todd and Julie Chrisley, they were supposed to be in prison for like 12 years for a fraud case that was federal. Of course, that didn't deal with a murder, but 12 years sometimes is more than you can get for killing somebody, depending on if it's manslaughter, negligent homicide, etc. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. We should find out what that sentence is in October. And once we're able to see those federal documents, then we should be able to know when things are going to go forward for the case here, the murder case here. But it is strange because if he can't go forward with any hearings because he can't physically show up, they're going to have to go through some of those evidentiary hearings before they can even get to the trial. So the likelihood of Anthonie Ruinard going to trial for murder before the end of the year is probably a lot less likely now. And in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking about Parker League's family trying to find out what happened, I know this just puts off justice that they hope will come. I think, too, the main thing with the trial that, from my perspective, is like, how on earth did Anthonie Ruinard, who's 37, and 18-year-old Parker League, ever become connected in the first place? We have no idea what the motive would possibly be in this case, what they were trying to do. And when we get to trial is when I think we would learn a lot more of that information. I assume investigators are keeping that close to the chest because, you know, they don't want that to get out before this case could go to court. He also could take a plea deal in the murder case. That happens a lot of the times too. So we'll be following this one closely. I hadn't heard a lot about it. And honestly, I was glad that Sean, our assignment desk editor, had checked into it. Like, what is going on here? Because it was weird. All of a sudden, it just seemed like everything really dropped off. So we're going to have to wait longer for that. I appreciate everybody who tuned in live to the show tonight. We're going to be posting clips on our social media pages, True Crime AZ Live, Instagram, and TikTok. And of course, we'll be back here next Thursday night. I've been telling people if you like NFL football, you just like put that on one screen and you put True Crime AZ Live on the other screen for Thursday Night Football and True Crime. There might be some crossover fans there. I'm one of them who loves sports and true crime. So I appreciate everybody tuning in live. And I know some people will watch this live or watch this on the back end as well. So thank you to everybody who's interested in these cases, interested in joining the show each week. We'll have more clips for you coming up. And I will already be starting on our show for next week tomorrow as we start to gather some of the cases that we expect to break or have updates for next week. That's True Crime AZ Live for tonight. I'm Brianna Whitney. I will see you guys next week. Thanks again.